$151 billion. That is the annual value of energy trade between the United States and Canada. 60% of American crude oil imports flow from Canadian pipelines. 85% of electricity imports cross the northern border. In March 2025, Ontario Premier Doug Ford threatened to cut off power to 1.5 million American homes. The threat lasted 48 hours before both sides backed down. But the underlying vulnerability remains unchanged. This analysis examines how energy interdependence between the United States and Canada has become a strategic pressure point in the ongoing trade confrontation. It explores the scale of American reliance on Canadian energy supplies. It documents what happened when Ontario imposed electricity surcharges on Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. And it considers what the July 2026 CUSMA review means for the future of North American energy security. The energy relationship between the United States and Canada represents one of the most integrated cross-border systems in the world. More than 30 major transmission lines connect American and Canadian electrical grids. Dozens of pipelines transport crude oil, natural gas, and refined petroleum products across the border. The infrastructure built over decades assumes continued cooperation. Disrupting these flows would require years of alternative investment that neither country has made. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the value of American energy imports from Canada totaled $124 billion in 2024. American energy exports to Canada reached $27 billion. The trade balance heavily favors Canada. This asymmetry creates leverage that Canadian officials have begun to acknowledge publicly. Crude oil represents the largest component of this energy trade. Canada supplies 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States. In July 2024, American imports of Canadian crude reached a record 4.3 million barrels per day following the expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are specifically configured to process heavy Canadian crude from Alberta oil sands. Converting these refineries to process lighter domestic crude would require billions in capital investment and years of construction. The pipeline infrastructure connecting Canadian oil fields to American refineries has no ready alternative. Most Canadian crude exports flow through pipelines terminating at refineries in Illinois, Oklahoma, and Texas. These refineries process Canadian heavy crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel for American consumers. Replacing this supply with domestic production is not feasible. American shale basins produce light sweet crude that requires different refining configurations. Natural gas trade follows similar patterns. Canada provided close to 100% of the natural gas imported by the United States through pipelines in 2023. Most of this gas arrives at the western and central portions of the border, supplying heating and electricity generation across the northern states. American natural gas exports to Canada flow primarily from northeastern states into Ontario and Quebec. The electricity relationship reveals even more concentrated dependencies. While electricity trade represents a smaller dollar value than petroleum, it provides essential grid stability for specific American regions. New England, New York, Michigan, and Minnesota all rely on Canadian hydropower imports. Some American communities have no domestic alternative. Maine presents the most acute case of energy vulnerability. According to the Maine Public Utilities Commission, the state imports approximately 30% of its electricity from Canada. More significantly, 80% of Maine's heating fuel and gasoline comes from Canadian refineries, primarily the Irving Oil facility in New Brunswick. Approximately 58,000 customers in northern and eastern Maine connect directly to the New Brunswick electrical grid. These ratepayers have no domestic supply option. Governor Janet Mills stated that Maine's economy and population are deeply intertwined with Canada. The state trades more than $6 billion in goods annually with its northern neighbor. Most of that trade flows from Canada into Maine. When tariffs increase costs on Canadian imports, Maine consumers pay disproportionately compared to other American states. The electricity crisis of March 2025 demonstrated how quickly energy interdependence can become weaponized. On March 4th, President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports, with a 10% tariff on energy products. The following week, Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on all electricity exports to the United States. The surcharge took effect on March 10th. It affected power flowing to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. Ontario's independent electricity system operator added $10 Canadian per megawatt hour to the cost of exported power. Ford stated the surcharge would generate $300,000 to $400,000 Canadian dollars per day. He estimated it would add approximately $100 Canadian dollars per month to electricity bills for affected American consumers. Ford's announcement included an explicit threat of escalation. He stated he would not hesitate to increase the surcharge further. He added that if the United States escalated its tariffs, he would not hesitate to shut off electricity exports completely. 1.5 million homes and businesses in 3 American states face the prospect of supply disruption. The market response was immediate. Stock indexes dropped sharply as investors calculated the potential economic damage from an energy trade confrontation. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 500 points on the day of Ford's announcement. Analysts warned that energy supply disruptions would ripple through manufacturing, agriculture, and residential heating markets across the northern United States. President Trump responded by threatening to double tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%. He posted on social media questioning why America would allow another country to supply its electricity. The rhetorical escalation suggested both sides were prepared to inflict mutual economic damage. The standoff resolved within 48 hours. Ontario Premier Ford and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick reached an agreement on March 11th. Ford suspended the electricity surcharge. In exchange, Lutnick agreed to meet with Ford in Washington to discuss a renewed USMCA framework. Trump subsequently reversed his threat to double steel and aluminum tariffs. The rapid de-escalation revealed that neither side wanted to test the consequences of actual energy supply disruption. But the episode exposed vulnerabilities that persist regardless of diplomatic outcomes. American grid operators in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota had begun preparing contingency plans for reduced Canadian supply. The fact that such planning became necessary demonstrated the strategic exposure. New York's independent system operator stated it was working to ensure stable electricity flows from Ontario. The grid manager expected to have adequate reserves to meet reliability criteria and forecasted demand. But adequate reserves under normal conditions differ from adequate reserves during extended supply disruption. The margin for error in electricity systems is measured in minutes, not days. The regional disparities in Canadian energy dependence create uneven political pressures. States along the northern border bear concentrated exposure to supply disruptions. States further south feel tariff impacts primarily through consumer prices rather than direct supply risk. This geographic distribution complicates federal policy responses that must balance competing regional interests. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey warned that tariffs could increase electricity costs by $100 million to $200 million statewide. Approximately 5 to 10% of the electricity New England consumes comes from Canada. The New England Power Generators Association noted that Canadian hydropower provides carbon-free baseload generation that operates continuously, unlike solar and wind resources that fluctuate with weather conditions. The Hydro-Quebec transmission lines into New England represent long-term contractual commitments. Quebec exports electricity under firm contracts with American utilities that guarantee supply over multi-year periods. These contracts provide price stability and supply security that spot market purchases cannot replicate. Disrupting these arrangements would force American utilities to find alternative generation sources at potentially higher costs and greater emissions. The ongoing construction of the New England Clean Energy Connect corridor illustrates the strategic importance of Canadian hydropower. This transmission line will carry electricity from Quebec through Maine to Massachusetts. The project faced local opposition and referendum challenges, but ultimately proceeded because Massachusetts needed the carbon-free power to meet its decarbonization requirements. No domestic alternative could provide equivalent capacity at comparable cost. The petroleum supply chain creates different but equally significant vulnerabilities. Canadian crude oil flows to American refineries through pipelines that took decades to build. The Keystone Pipeline System, the Enbridge Mainline, and the Trans Mountain expansion represent billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. These pipelines connect Canadian production basins to American refining centers through routes optimized over years of planning and construction. Replacing Canadian crude imports would require either dramatically increased domestic production or imports from overseas suppliers. Domestic production production faces geological constraints. American shale basins produce light sweet crude, while many American refineries are configured for heavy sour crude like Canadian oil sands production. Importing from overseas suppliers would require tanker shipments with longer supply chains and higher transportation costs. The Trans Mountain pipeline expansion that began commercial operation in May 2024 gives Canada new optionality. For the first time, significant volumes of Alberta crude can reach Pacific Coast ports for export to Asian markets. This reduces Canadian dependence on American buyers. Canada now has alternatives that did not exist when the pipeline system was designed exclusively for north-south flows. Canadian officials have explicitly discussed using energy exports as leverage in trade negotiations. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced measures to diversify Canadian trade relationships away from exclusive American dependence. Official statements describe the decades-long process of ever closer Canada-U.S. economic integration as having ended. Canadian policy now treats concentration on American markets as strategic vulnerability requiring correction. The tariff confrontation has accelerated Canadian efforts to develop domestic markets and alternative export destinations. Mills and refineries that previously shipped almost exclusively to the United States are now pursuing European and Asian customers. Each year of trade friction strengthens the business case for Canadian supply chain diversification. These shifts may prove difficult to reverse even if trade relations normalize. American refiners face the inverse problem. Their facilities are configured for Canadian crude. Their logistics networks assume Canadian supply. Switching to alternative feedstocks would require capital expenditure and operational changes that take years to implement. The asymmetry means Canadian producers have more flexibility than American processors in a prolonged trade confrontation. The July 2026 CUSMA review represents a critical inflection point for North American energy trade. The Canada-United States-Mexico agreement requires the three countries to confirm whether they wish to extend the agreement for another 16 years. Without unanimous agreement to extend, a 10-year countdown to agreement termination begins. President Trump called the agreement transitional and suggested it may have served its purpose. The CUSMA currently exempts most Canadian goods from the highest tariff rates. Eliminating this exemption would dramatically increase costs for Canadian energy exports and American energy imports simultaneously. Energy trade falls into a complex regulatory space under the agreement. Electricity was historically not subject to explicit tariff treatment under North American trade rules. The Ontario surcharge episode revealed that neither government had clear legal frameworks for managing electricity trade disputes. This regulatory ambiguity creates uncertainty for utilities, grid operators, and consumers. The economic stakes extend beyond direct energy costs. The Tax Foundation estimated that current tariffs add approximately $1,300 annually to the average American household budget. Energy tariffs contribute to this burden through higher gasoline prices, higher electricity rates, and higher costs for goods manufactured with energy inputs. These costs fall disproportionately on lower-income households that spend larger shares of their budgets on energy. Canadian retaliation has targeted American exports with equivalent tariff rates. The Canadian government imposed 30 billion Canadian dollars in retaliatory tariffs on American goods, including orange juice, peanut butter, coffee, appliances, footwear, and cosmetics. These tariffs particularly affect American manufacturers in states that supported the current administration. The political targeting is intentional and designed to maximize pressure on American trade policy. The energy confrontation has reshaped how both countries think about continental integration. For decades, policymakers assumed that economic interdependence would prevent serious trade conflicts. The logic held that mutual dependence created mutual vulnerability that neither side would exploit. The events of 2025 demonstrated that this assumption no longer holds. Both governments have shown willingness to weaponize economic relationships for political objectives. The infrastructure implications extend beyond immediate trade disputes. American utilities considering new interconnections with Canadian power sources must now factor political risk into investment decisions. Canadian energy companies evaluating pipeline expansions must consider whether American markets will remain accessible over project lifetimes. Political uncertainty increases the cost of capital and slows investment in integrated infrastructure. Climate policy adds another dimension to energy trade calculations. Canadian hydropower provides zero-emission electricity that helps American states meet decarbonization targets. Replacing this power with natural gas generation would increase emissions while potentially increasing costs. The environmental benefits of cross-border electricity trade create constituencies that oppose disruption, even among groups otherwise skeptical of trade agreements. The northern border states face the most immediate consequences, regardless of how the broader trade confrontation resolves. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and the Pacific Northwest all depend on Canadian energy supplies to varying degrees. Governors and utility regulators in these states must plan for scenarios ranging from continued cooperation to extended disruption. The planning itself consumes resources and creates uncertainty that affects economic decisions. Several factors suggest the energy relationship will remain contentious regardless of diplomatic efforts. First, the precedent of using energy as leverage has been established. Both sides now know that energy trade can be weaponized and have developed playbooks for doing so. Second, the political incentives for confrontation remain. Trade policy provides visible opportunities for leaders to demonstrate strength to domestic audiences. Third, the underlying trade imbalances persist. Canada exports far more energy to the United States than it imports, creating structural tensions that policy cannot eliminate. The path forward requires recognizing that energy security and trade policy have become permanently intertwined. American policymakers must consider supply chain resilience when evaluating tariff actions. Canadian policymakers must consider market access when pursuing retaliatory measures. Both sides must accept that the era of assuming automatic cooperation has ended. The $151 billion annual energy trade between the United States and Canada represents mutual dependence that benefits both economies under normal conditions. American consumers access reliable, affordable energy supplies. Canadian producers access the world's largest energy market. The infrastructure built over decades enables efficient flows that alternative arrangements cannot replicate. The regional electricity dependencies merit closer examination. Quebec and Ontario together produce over half of Canada's electricity and account for over half of electricity exports to the United States. Quebec's hydroelectric capacity makes it a particularly valuable supplier. The province generates 94% of its electricity from hydropower, providing carbon-free baseload generation that operates regardless of weather conditions. Between 2021 and 2023, Ontario exported 14.6, 14.2, and 12 terawatt-hours of electricity to the United States, respectively. Ontario maintains 26 transmission connections with neighboring jurisdictions, including 7 with New York, 4 with Michigan, and 1 with Minnesota. These interconnections enable real-time balancing of supply and demand across international boundaries. Manitoba provides 13% of Minnesota's electricity needs. This dependence is expected to grow as the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which oversees transmission in several Midwest states, anticipates supply shortfalls. The retirement of coal-fired power plants combined with growing demand and slower than anticipated new generation construction creates gaps that Canadian imports help fill. New Brunswick supplies power to 58,000 customers in northern and eastern Maine who have no domestic alternative. Van Buren Light and Power, a consumer-owned utility in Aroostook County, connects exclusively to the New Brunswick electrical grid. The utility manager stated that a tariff would cost ratepayers an additional $94 annually. For residents of a rural border community, that represents a meaningful budget impact. The New England grid faces particular challenges from any disruption of Canadian supply. The region relies heavily on natural gas for electricity generation, approximately 60% of total production. Nuclear power provides another 26%. Canadian hydropower supplies the remaining baseload, providing reliable generation when natural gas prices spike or nuclear plants undergo maintenance. Energy analysts note that if tariffs force Canadian producers out of hourly and daily electricity markets, American utilities would need to replace that power primarily with natural gas generation. Whether this produces noticeable cost increases depends largely on natural gas prices. In 2023, when drought reduced Quebec hydropower capacity, natural gas prices were low enough to offset the supply reduction. But natural gas prices are volatile and driven by factors beyond regional control. The Acadia Center, a New England environmental organization, warned that increased reliance on natural gas would drive up prices as demand increases. Natural gas pipeline capacity into New England is constrained, particularly during winter heating season when residential demand competes with power plant demand. Additional Canadian electricity imports help relieve this constraint by reducing the need for gas-fired generation. The construction timeline for alternative generation capacity extends years beyond any immediate trade dispute. New natural gas plants require permitting, financing, and construction periods measured in years. Renewable energy projects face their own permitting challenges and intermittency limitations. No supply alternative can replace Canadian imports on a timeline matching political decisions made in weeks or months. American energy independence has become a political talking point that obscures the reality of regional dependencies. The United States as a whole produces more energy than it consumes on a net basis. But production and consumption do not occur in the same locations. Canadian imports flow to specific regions that cannot easily access domestic alternatives. The national aggregate masks the vulnerability of northern border communities. The trade confrontation has revealed that mutual dependence also creates mutual vulnerability. Either side can inflict economic damage on the other by restricting energy flows. The damage would not be symmetric. Some American regions face acute supply risks while Canadian producers would lose their primary export market. But asymmetric damage is still damage that both sides have incentive to avoid. The precedent established in March 2025 changed how both governments approach energy trade. Ontario demonstrated that electricity could be used as a retaliatory tool. The Trump administration demonstrated willingness to escalate tariffs in response. Both sides now possess playbooks for energy confrontation that did not exist before. Future trade disputes will unfold against this backdrop of demonstrated willingness to weaponize energy flows. Canadian provincial governments have developed their own leverage independent of federal policy. Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Manitoba each control significant electricity export capacity. Provincial premiers can act unilaterally on energy policy without federal approval. This creates multiple potential pressure points that American negotiators must consider when crafting trade policy. The July 2026 CUSMA review will determine whether North American energy integration continues on its current trajectory or enters a period of managed disengagement. The outcome will affect electricity rates in New England, gasoline prices in the Midwest, and heating costs across the northern states. American consumers who have never considered the source of their energy will experience the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Ottawa. The stakes extend beyond the immediate trade dispute. Investment decisions made today will shape North American energy infrastructure for decades. Utilities deciding whether to sign long-term power purchase agreements with Canadian suppliers must now factor political risk into their calculations. Pipeline companies evaluating expansion projects must consider whether American market access will remain reliable. The uncertainty itself imposes costs that consumers ultimately bear. Both countries face a fundamental choice about the future of continental energy integration. They can recommit to the cooperative framework that enabled decades of efficient energy trade, or they can pursue separate paths that reduce mutual dependence at the cost of higher prices and reduced reliability. The economic logic favors continued integration. The political dynamics push toward confrontation. How this tension resolves will define North American energy markets for a generation. The July 2026 CUSMA review will determine whether North American energy integration continues on its current trajectory or enters a period of managed disengagement. The outcome will affect electricity rates in New England, gasoline prices in the Midwest, and heating costs across the northern states. American consumers who have never considered the source of their energy will experience the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Ottawa. $151 billion in annual trade, 60% of American crude imports, 85% of electricity imports, 1.5 million homes threatened with supply disruption during 48 hours in March. These numbers define the scale of American exposure to Canadian energy policy decisions. The infrastructure of interdependence took decades to build. The political will to maintain it can disappear in days. American energy security now depends on diplomatic relationships that recent events have demonstrated are more fragile than previously assumed. The bills that arrive each month for electricity, gasoline, and heating fuel reflect this reality, whether consumers recognize it or not.